Usually when we encounter ancient history, um, we kind of approach it with this built-in expectation of distance.
Oh, absolutely. Like a museum exhibit.
Yeah, exactly. Like you walk through the halls, you look at the crumbling basalt statues, you study the faded hieroglyphs under that really soft lighting.
Right. And there's this thick pane of safety glass between you and the past.
Yes. You could just point at it and say, well, that's a fascinating look at how primitive societies used to conceptualize the world.
It's safe. It allows us to view ancient empires as just stepping stones to our current state of enlightenment, really.
Right. We keep the violence, the theology, and, well, the raw terror of those civilizations neatly contained.
Right. In the realm of academia, it protects our modern sensibilities from having to actually grapple with what they experienced.
But then, and this is why we're here today, you step into the world of biblical narrative, specifically the plagues of Egypt. And that museum glass just it completely shatters.
It does. You're no longer looking at a sanitized artifact at all.
No, you're looking at a historical and theological landscape that is, frankly, terrifying in its scope. So, welcome to Reformed Thinking. I'm so glad you're joining us for this deep dive.
It's going to be an intense one.
It really is. Today, we're going to meticulously dismantle that safe, comfortable view of the ancient world. We're unpacking a singular, awe-inspiring passage, which is Exodus 11, verses 4 through 8.
And to do this, we're pulling from two incredibly dense, very complementary sources.
Right, these are extensive theological commentaries and some rigorous exegetical papers focused on what the authors call the midnight judgment.
And the sovereign distinction of God.
Yeah. And the stakes in these sources, they are set remarkably high, aren't they?
Oh, absolutely. The authors, they aren't treating this as mere folklore or, a morality play.
Right.
They are analyzing a moment where finite human power at its absolute zenith just collides head-on with infinite divine sovereignty.
So for you listening, this is the lens we're using today. This isn't just an ancient story. Our sources present it as a terrifying, awe-inspiring blueprint of justice.
And grace.
Right, and grace. And really, the actual mechanics of the universe when the ultimate creator steps directly into space and time.
So to really grasp the terror of this 10th plague, we have to strip away our 21st century democratic worldview entirely.
Yeah, we have to step into the cultural and political powder keg of late Bronze Age Egypt.
Exactly. Our sources pinpoint this showdown right around 1446 BC.
Which is during the apex of the 18th dynasty, right?
Yes. This is Egypt at the absolute height of its wealth, its military supremacy, its architectural glory.
Just a sprawling, untouchable empire.
And at the absolute center of it all is Pharaoh. But the key here, and we really need to get this, is that Pharaoh was not just a king.
Or an emperor.
Right, or a political figurehead. In Egyptian royal theology, he was literally considered a living god.
The sources use a specific Egyptian term for this, right? The Neter-Nefer.
Yeah, Neter-Nefer.
Yeah.
Which roughly translates to the good god. The population actually believed he was the earthly, breathing embodiment of Horus.
Wow. The living son of the sun god Ra.
Exactly. And his primary function, the very reason the empire existed at all, was to be the supreme maintainer of this concept called Ma'at.
Ma'at. Which is one of those concepts that is just so foreign to us now, right? But it was the glue of their entire civilization.
It really was. It represents cosmic order, truth, and harmony.
Because the Egyptians believed the universe was, constantly under threat by the forces of chaos, right?
Yes, and Pharaoh was the solitary linchpin holding the cosmos together. He guaranteed the sun would rise, the Nile would flood, the crops would grow.
He was literally the barrier against the dark.
Which means, any threat to Pharaoh was not just treason. It was an existential threat to the fabric of reality itself.
So when we factor in the Israelites enduring 400 years of brutal bondage under this regime, the sources argue we have to view that oppression through this specific theological lens.
Right. It wasn't merely a matter of the Egyptian state requiring cheap labor for construction projects.
Or just wanting to exploit a minority population for economic gain.
No, the state sanctioned infanticide we see early in Exodus. The decree to throw Hebrew baby boys into the Nile.
Yeah, that was a demonic, calculated attempt to destroy the covenant line.
Exactly. Our sources tie that oppression directly back to the promise in Genesis 3.
The prophecy of the seed of the woman who would eventually crush the serpent.
Right. So the Egyptian empire was essentially functioning as the serpent's proxy here.
Trying to obliterate the redemptive future of humanity by wiping out the Hebrew people.
And viewing it that way, it completely changes how we're supposed to interpret the 10 plagues.
Totally. They are not random ecological anomalies,
Right. They aren't just a series of unfortunate natural disasters that some primitive people retroactively attributed to their deity.
which is how a lot of liberal higher criticism tries to explain the text. Like, oh, it's a red tide in the Nile.
Yeah, the sources completely reject that. The text presents a targeted, systematic dismantling of the entire Egyptian pantheon and worldview.
And this culminates in the 10th plague, which centers entirely on the concept of the firstborn,
Or in Hebrew, the Bikor.
the Bikor. Okay, so to understand the weight of this, we have to look at ancient Near Eastern culture.
Yeah, which we see reflected in legal frameworks of the time, like the Code of Hammurabi.
Right.
The firstborn son wasn't simply, the oldest sibling in the house.
No, the Bikor was the anchor of the entire societal and familial structure. They received the double portion of the inheritance.
They assumed the political and economic leadership of the clan upon the father's death.
But even more crucially for the Egyptians, they served as the representative of the family's ancestral priesthood.
Exactly. They were the ones responsible for maintaining the domestic shrines and ensuring the afterlife of the ancestors through these daily offerings.
Wow. And when you scale that up to the royal family, the firstborn son was the heir to the throne, the co-regent, and the ultimate guarantee that this god-king dynasty, the maintainers of cosmic order, would just continue uninterrupted.
So when Yahweh announces he is going to strike the firstborn of Egypt, he is launching an act of total divine warfare against the structural, economic, religious, and existential core of the empire.
It makes me think of Pharaoh as a sort of ancient equivalent to a modern billionaire tech CEO.
Oh, that's an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah, like someone who has built this massive, inescapable digital empire, controls all the algorithms, and has become so insulated by his own power that he genuinely believes he has programmed the universe.
Right, right.
And in that context, this 10th plague is essentially God bypassing all the firewalls and just unplugging Pharaoh's main server to prove who actually owns the power grid.
I love that. And building on that analogy, God isn't just unplugging the server. He is demonstrating that the entire operating system of Egypt was built on phantom code.
Wow.
Striking the Bikor is a direct attack on Pharaoh's claim to divine succession. Furthermore, our sources emphasize that this plague was a hyper-specific polemic against the most revered deities in Egypt.
Like Osiris, right?
Right. You have Osiris, the god of life, and the judge of the underworld, who is supposed to grant life after death.
Then you have Isis, the supreme goddess of protection and magic.
And Selkut, the guardian deity of life and breath.
So the Midnight Judgment exposes every single one of these supposed cosmic powers as completely fraudulent and powerless before Yahweh.
It is a devastating, systemic collapse of an entire civilization's worldview.
Yeah. And what the authors of our sources find so compelling is that this historical showdown isn't recorded as a dry, clinical list of facts.
Right. They point out that Moses constructed this narrative under divine inspiration with just stunning literary precision.
The very structure of the text is designed to reveal the perfect justice of God.
Yeah. If we look at the broader architecture of the plagues, they are deliberately grouped in 3 cycles of 3.
Okay, unpack that a bit.
Well, the first 9 plagues operate in these tight, distinct triads. They escalate in severity and chaos. But the 10th plague, the Midnight Judgment, stands completely outside of that cycle. It stands alone in its finality and its theological weight.
And Moses utilizes a really profound literary device here called an inclusio, right?
Yes, an inclusio. It's essentially a set of textual bookends that links this final judgment directly back to the very beginning of the conflict in Exodus chapter 1.
Our sources call this the execution of the lex talionis, the ancient law of retribution.
Which we commonly know as an eye for an eye.
Right. In Exodus 1.22, Pharaoh issued that tyrannical decree to cast every single Hebrew male infant into the Nile River.
He actively attempted to exterminate God's declared firstborn son.
Which is exactly the title God uses for the nation of Israel in Exodus chapter 4, isn't it?
It is. Now here in Exodus 11, the exact harvest of that murderous seed is reaped upon Egypt.
The oppressor who sought to drown God's firstborn now loses his own. The literary symmetry there is just impossible to miss.
And it serves a massive theological purpose. It demonstrates that the judgment falling on Egypt is not an act of capricious rage.
Right. God is not arbitrary. He is not throwing a divine temper tantrum in the heavens.
No, the judgment exactly mirrors the crime.
And for you listening, the implication our sources draw from this is staggering. It shows a universe governed by an absolute, immutable moral law, not by random, chaotic fate.
You reap what you sow, and here we see it executed on a national, even cosmic scale.
And to fully appreciate the weight of this moment, we have to look at the incredible narrative tension bridging chapter 10 and chapter 11.
Oh, it's so cinematic. The end of chapter 10 leaves us in this breathless pause.
Right, the ninth plague, a thick, suffocating supernatural darkness that could be physically felt, has just lifted.
And Pharaoh is in an absolute state of demonic rage. He summons Moses, tells him to get out, and threatens him with immediate execution.
Yeah, he says, "Take care never to see my face again, for on the day you see my face, you shall die."
And Moses, who, years earlier was a terrified fugitive hiding in the desert.
Yeah, now he's totally unfazed. He just stares him down.
He looks at the most powerful, supposedly divine man on earth and simply agrees with him. He says, "As you say, I will not see your face again."
The cinematic intensity of that exchange is just incredible, and it is right in that tense, silent room before turning his back on Pharaoh forever that Moses delivers this final, chilling oracle from God.
Which brings us chronologically into the exegesis of the text itself, starting with the anatomy of this judgment in verses 4 through 6.
Okay, let's get into the text.
Moses doesn't begin with a personal threat. He begins with a very specific, authoritative prophetic formula. Thus says the Lord.
Right. In the Hebrew, this is the ko-amar YHWH.
Exactly. By using that formula, Moses establishes that he is not a political revolutionary acting on personal vendettas.
No, he's strictly an authorized divine mouthpiece. The authority and the terror rests entirely in the one who is speaking.
Yes. Moses announces both the time and the agent of the impending doom. He says, "About midnight, I am going out into the midst of Egypt."
And our sources spend a significant amount of time focusing on the underlying grammar of that statement, don't they?
They do, specifically the active nature of it. The Hebrew text uses an independent personal pronoun paired with an active participle.
Okay.
Yahweh says, "I'm going out." The theological implication here is immense.
Right. This is not a passive event. God isn't simply removing his hand of providential protection and allowing nature to take its course.
He isn't sending a localized disease vector or delegating this to a natural phenomenon.
Yahweh himself is actively stepping into space and time to personally execute holy judgment.
And as one of our sources notes, this grammatical reality completely shatters the deistic delusion that God is merely a passive, detached observer of human depravity who, just winds up the clock and walks away.
Right. God is intimately, terrifyingly involved in the execution of his justice. And then we get the scope of this judgment in verse 5, which is sweeping in its totality.
Yeah, Moses declares, "Every firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne, even to the firstborn of the slave girl who is behind the handmills."
The phrasing here is a classic Hebrew literary device known as a merism.
Right, a merism is a figure of speech that states two absolute extremes to encompass everything that exists between them.
So you have the imperial summit of divine monarchy, Pharaoh's throne, the pinnacle of human power and wealth.
And this is contrasted with the absolute lowest, most degrading socioeconomic station conceivable in the ancient world, the servant girl grinding grain at the handmill.
Because operating a handmill in the ancient Near East was brutal, back-breaking labor, wasn't it?
Oh, it was awful. It involved grinding heavy stones together for hours just to produce enough flour for the day's bread, breathing in the dust, destroying your joints.
It was the work of the lowest captives and slaves. So by bridging these two extremes, the text makes a profound statement about the nature of divine justice.
It really does.
We see this in our own world constantly, Wealth, status, and power routinely insulate people from the consequences of their actions.
Oh, definitely. People can buy elite legal defense. They can hire private security. They can move their assets to offshore accounts. They retreat to gated compounds.
But this text reveals that God's justice is the ultimate inescapable equalizer. It completely bypasses every earthly security system.
The palace guards, the thick walls of the royal compound, the vast wealth of the 18th dynasty, they offer absolutely zero immunity.
And conversely, the poverty, obscurity, and marginalized status of the slave girl offer no exemption either.
The text forces the reader to confront the reality that no social boundary and no political power can shield a human being from the moral sentence of God.
Wow. And the inevitable result of this inescapable judgment is described in verse 6. Moses says, "There shall be a great cry throughout all the land of Egypt, such as there has never been nor ever will be again."
The Hebrew phrase used here is siaka gedala.
Siaka gedala.
And that phrase carries an incredible linguistic weight. It denotes an agonizing, unprecedented shriek of collective horror.
It isn't just the sound of mourning.
No, it is the visceral reaction to sudden, inexplicable catastrophe. It is the sound of an entire empire discovering, far too late, that the warnings of God were not empty religious rhetoric.
Because Pharaoh had spent months negotiating, delaying, making false promises, right? He treated God's commands as if they were just suggestions from some lesser tribal deity.
Exactly. And this great cry is the final, irreversible consequence of that hardened unbelief.
It is a heavy, sobering reality to process. But the narrative doesn't stay in Egypt.
No, it pivots sharply.
Our sources identify verse 7 as the absolute theological turning point of this entire deep dive. Because if midnight brings this inescapable, agonizing scream to mainland Egypt, the immediate question is, what is happening geographically right next door in Goshen?
Where the millions of enslaved Israelites live. Yes, it is the hinge upon which the entire theology of the passage turns.
So while the greatest empire on earth is engulfed in this catastrophic wailing, Moses says regarding the Israelites, "But against any of the people of Israel, not a dog shall growl, either against man or beast."
And then he provides the explicit theological reason for this contrast, that you may know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel.
I want to spend some time unpacking this image of the silent dogs because our sources dive deep into the cultural background here, and it illuminates the text in such a profound way. It's an ancient Near Eastern idiom, right?
Yes. In ancient cities and encampments, and we see this documented extensively in extra-biblical texts like the Amarna letters, packs of scavenger dogs constantly prowled the streets.
Right.
They were semi-feral, feeding on refuse, and if there was any disturbance in the night, an invading army moving into position, a thief creeping through an alley, a sudden death in a home, or even what the ancients perceived as demonic activity.
These dogs would just go crazy.
Yes, they'd set off this wild, cascading howling and barking across the entire settlement.
They functioned essentially as the ancient world's communal burglar alarms.
Exactly.
So for Moses to declare that not a single dog will even sharpen its tongue, which is the literal Hebrew translation, right?
Yes, or move its tongue to growl.
To say that during a mass casualty event of unprecedented scale, it is a staggering claim. Death is literally flying over the entire nation of Egypt, executing millions. Yet over the region of Goshen, there is a divinely ordered, supernatural tranquility.
It's an almost Edenic picture of peace. God is demonstrating that his sovereignty extends down to controlling the vocal cords of feral street scavengers in the middle of the night.
It's unbelievable. But this dramatic contrast creates a significant theological tension, doesn't it? One that both of our sources are very eager to address.
Oh, they tackle it head on. Because the modern, sentimental reading of this story assumes that Israel was spared because they were the good guys.
We tend to project a moral superiority onto the oppressed, like they were victims, so they must have been righteous.
But the sources aggressively push back against that assumption. Israel was not a nation of flawless saints. They were deeply entrenched in the idolatry of Egypt.
Right. We see later in the wilderness narrative that they constantly rebel. They build a golden calf. They complain against God's provision.
They're a stubborn, sinful people.
So the glaring question is, why do they get this supernatural Edenic protection while Egypt gets the great cry of death? What actually makes them so special?
The answer our authors draw out lies in the specific Hebrew verb Moses uses for God making a distinction.
Okay, let's dig into the linguistics again.
The word is pala. To grasp the nuance, we have to look at what Moses chose not to say.
Right?
He didn't use the common word badal, which simply means to physically divide two things, like separating light from darkness in Genesis.
Okay.
He also didn't use the word bachar, which means to choose something based on its inherent qualities or usefulness.
He specifically used pala.
Yes, and pala denotes a miraculous, sovereign, entirely unexplainable setting apart. The sources synthesize this linguistic reality by explaining the theological doctrine of unconditional election.
Meaning Israel's safety in Goshen is not based on their moral merit, their ethnic superiority, or their track record of good behavior.
Not at all. It is based entirely on God's sovereign decree and his unilateral covenant promise made to Abraham centuries prior. Grace, and grace alone, is the only thing that makes the difference.
As one of the commentaries plainly states, God makes the difference, not the sinner.
Exactly. If Yahweh had not made that sovereign, unmerited distinction, the Israelites would have perished right alongside the Egyptians.
Because according to the strict scales of divine justice, They deserve the exact same judgment.
They really did.
It forces you listening to realize this isn't some fairy tale of the heroes defeating the villains.
Right.
It's a terrifying historical record of a holy God executing perfect justice on the unrepentant, while simultaneously demonstrating unmerited distinguishing grace to a people he sovereignly chose to save.
And that sudden injection of sovereign grace completely shatters the political and social hierarchy of the Egyptian empire.
Which leads directly into verse 8, right, where we witness an incredible, dramatic inversion of power.
After announcing this terrifying distinction, Moses tells Pharaoh that soon Pharaoh's own royal servants, the elite court officials, the military commanders, the very men who violently enforced the enslavement of Israel,
They will come down from the palace, prostrate themselves on the ground before Moses, and beg the Israelites to leave.
the proud masters of the known world, will be bowing down in the dust before the shepherd prophet of a slave nation.
It is the total subversion of worldly power structures.
Yeah.
I mean, Pharaoh genuinely believed he was the ultimate authority, the maintainer of cosmic order.
But his own government, his own royal court, is going to collapse in sheer terror and submit entirely to the word of Yahweh.
And the encounter ends with a fascinating detail. The text notes that Moses went out from Pharaoh's presence in hot anger, or in the original Hebrew, pachoriav.
The linguistics of ancient Hebrew regarding human emotion are incredibly visceral and physiological.
Right. Bochoreyev literally translates to in the burning of the nose or the burning of the nostril.
It describes the physical sensation of flaring nostrils and rapid breathing when a person is consumed by intense emotion.
But in our modern context, especially in therapeutic or psychological frameworks, we often view anger as inherently negative.
Yeah, like a loss of control, a personal temper tantrum, or a sign of emotional immaturity.
It would be very easy for a modern reader to look at this text and think Moses is just losing his temper because Pharaoh was arrogant and rude to him.
But the sources are crystal clear that we cannot map our modern, often carnal definitions of anger onto this moment.
Right. The anger Moses is experiencing is not carnal malice or wounded pride.
The sources define it as a holy prophetic reflection of God's own righteous indignation.
Moses is experiencing a localized human echo of divine jealousy and wrath against a tyrant who has refused to repent after 9 devastating supernatural warnings.
Moses is not angry for himself. He is furious for the glory of God, which Pharaoh has continually insulted.
He is also angry at the sheer, senseless devastation that Pharaoh's stubbornness is bringing upon his own people.
A leader who absolutely refuses to repent, as the commentaries note, is the most spiritually and physically dangerous force in a society.
So zooming out from the immediate historical context, both of our sources make a massive theological pivot here.
They really do.
They argue that this ancient narrative in Exodus is not just a self-contained historical event. It is a massive, redemptive historical archetype.
It is a foundational signpost that points straight through the centuries into the New Testament.
And the author spent a great deal of time unpacking the Christological typology embedded in this plague, and it completely reframes the entire concept of the Exodus.
The interpretive key here is reading the Old Testament the way Jesus instructed his disciples to read it.
Right, with the understanding that all the scriptures ultimately point to him and his redemptive work.
In that light, Exodus 11 is not just an origin story for the nation of Israel. It is a profound structural shadow of ultimate cosmic salvation.
To understand this, the sources look at the immediate context that follows in chapter 12, the institution of the Passover.
As we established, the Israelites didn't survive the midnight judgment because of their inherent goodness.
They survived because a substitute, a physically unblemished lamb, was slain in their place, and the blood of that lamb was applied to the wooden doorposts of their homes.
The blood itself is the actual mechanism of that sovereign distinction we talked about earlier.
It was the visual marker of a satisfied judgment.
Precisely, and the New Testament writers make this connection explicit. The Apostle Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 5:7, Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed.
The complex theology operating beneath the surface of this narrative is penal substitutionary atonement.
Yes. The concept is that a holy, perfectly just judge cannot simply ignore sin. Justice must be served.
However, in his mercy, he provides a righteous refuge from his own judgment. Justice was satisfied in Egypt through the death of their firstborn. Justice was satisfied for Israel through the death of the substitute lamb.
And for the Christian, the sources argue, justice is satisfied exclusively in the substitutionary death of Jesus Christ on the cross.
And the typological connections go even deeper when we look at the specific language of the firstborn. Jesus is the ultimate Bikor.
Yes. In Colossians 1:15, Paul refers to Jesus as the firstborn of all creation, highlighting his preeminence and his status as the eternal Son of God.
In the narrative of Egypt, the firstborn died under the curse of divine judgment due to human sin and rebellion.
But at the cross, God the Father deliberately delivered up his own sinless, eternal firstborn Son to bear the unmitigated infinite wrath that human rebellion deserved.
The sources also point out a striking, almost haunting symmetry regarding the physical element of darkness.
Oh, this is profound. Exodus 11 specifies that this terrifying judgment happens at midnight, the hour of absolute deepest darkness.
Right. And when we turn to the gospel accounts of the crucifixion, what happens when Jesus, the true Passover lamb, hangs on the cross?
The Gospels record that a supernatural darkness covered the entire earth from the 6th hour to the 9th hour.
The middle of the day literally became midnight.
Jesus entered the ultimate, horrifying darkness of divine retribution. He experienced the active, terrifying visitation of divine justice, the very thing Egypt experienced, so that his people could be permanently translated into the light.
The tyrant Pharaoh and his empire could not hold the people God had sovereignly determined to redeem.
In the exact same way, the spiritual powers of sin, death, and demonic oppression cannot hold those who are united by faith to the risen Christ.
It is a staggering theological framework. It takes the Exodus from being just a fascinating historical account of political liberation and elevates it into the canonical blueprint for how spiritual salvation operates.
Absolutely.
Now, because this text reveals the fundamental, unyielding nature of divine sovereignty and justice, the authors of our sources do not leave this in the ancient world.
No, they don't.
They aggressively apply the theology of Exodus 11 to modern culture. They use this text as an ideological wrecking ball to dismantle several contemporary systems of thought.
It is fascinating to report on how these authors take this ancient framework and use it as a lens to critique our world today. They don't pull any punches.
And before we get into this, I want to explicitly frame this section for you listening. Our sources take incredibly strong, uncompromising stances against several modern theological and political movements. To be clear, we aren't taking sides or endorsing these critiques, but we are impartially reporting on how these authors weaponize this ancient text against modern culture.
Right. They systematically work through several major cultural and theological movements. First, they aim directly at pragmatism and therapeutic culture within the modern church.
Okay, unpack that. How does Exodus 11 confront therapeutic culture?
Well, the sources argue that modern religious frameworks have essentially domesticated God.
They claim we have turned the creator of the universe into a harmless, benevolent therapist whose primary function is to make sinners feel comfortable, affirmed, and self-actualized.
And the authors argue that reading Exodus 11 destroys that caricature entirely.
They insist the text demands a return to preaching the terrifying, unmitigated holiness and wrath of God.
Arguing that true, lasting comfort can only be found when a person actually understands the severity of the cosmic judgment they have been saved from.
Because if you shrink the wrath of God, you inevitably shrink the grace of God.
Precisely. From there, the sources move into deep theological critique, specifically targeting the system of Arminianism.
Arminian theology generally asserts that divine election is conditioned upon God looking down the corridors of time and foreseeing human faith, right?
Yes. It places the ultimate decisive factor of salvation in the autonomous free will of man.
And our authors claim that the phrase in Exodus 11.7, Yahweh makes a distinction, utterly dismantles that entire framework.
They unpack the difference between synergism, the idea that God and man cooperate in salvation, and monergism.
And the sources insist that the Exodus narrative proves salvation is entirely monergistic.
It is God's work alone, from beginning to end, based purely on his sovereign decree and not on any foreseen human merit, choice, or potential.
God makes the difference, not the sinner. The Israelite didn't choose to be passed over. God decreed it.
The authors also apply the text to the modern prosperity gospel.
Oh, this is a fascinating critique.
They use the reality of the 10th plague to expose the absolute bankruptcy of treating faith as a mechanism for material wealth.
They point out a glaring historical fact, right? Pharaoh and his royal court possessed literally all the gold, power, luxury, and advanced medical knowledge of the ancient world.
They were the apex of human prosperity.
Yet when the midnight judgment arrived, all of that unparalleled wealth couldn't buy a single solitary day of life for Pharaoh's son.
The sources argue this proves that true blessing has absolutely nothing to do with material prosperity, bank accounts, or physical health.
True blessing is exclusively defined as being covered by the blood of the Lamb when the justice of God arrives.
Furthermore, the sources take on modern sociological frameworks, specifically critical race theory, or CRT.
Right. They critique CRT as a secular philosophy that attempts to view all of human history through the lens of oppressor versus oppressed racial and power dynamics.
The authors argue that the Exodus narrative rejects this paradigm entirely.
They point out that God does not judge Egypt simply because they are the macro-political oppressors.
And he doesn't save Israel simply because they're the marginalized, oppressed minority.
Because if that were true, Israel wouldn't have needed the blood of the Lamb on their doors.
Instead, the sources argue the text demands we view history exclusively through the absolute moral dichotomy of God's perfect holiness versus human sin.
Justice, in this biblical framework, belongs solely to God's moral law, not to shifting secular ideological movements.
Finally, the commentaries provide a very practical, apologetic application for dealing with modern cults.
Specifically mentioning how to engage with the theology of Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormonism.
The authors instruct readers to use Exodus 11, paired with texts like Colossians 1, as a tool for evangelism.
They point out that Jehovah's Witnesses view Jesus as the archangel Michael, a created being.
And Mormon theology views Jesus as a created spirit brother of Lucifer.
But the sources argue that by connecting Yahweh, the uncreated, absolute, terrifying God of the Exodus, who executes the midnight judgment to Jesus, whom the New Testament identifies as the ultimate firstborn.
It mathematically proves the absolute eternal deity of Christ. Jesus isn't a created angel, he is the God who spoke from the burning bush.
It is incredible how a single ancient passage of Scripture acts as such a comprehensive ideological filter for these authors.
They use it to demand total submission to a sovereign God, refusing to bend the text to fit modern cultural preferences.
The text forces an unavoidable confrontation with reality. As we synthesize all of this, the ultimate takeaway from the Midnight Judgment is that neutrality is an illusion.
The text demands deep, uncomfortable self-reflection from everyone who reads it. We have to look at the narrative and ask ourselves, where might we be acting like Pharaoh today?
That is the pivotal question. You listening, me, all of us, we are all standing somewhere on this theological map.
We are either standing in the Egypt of our own autonomy, relying on our wealth, our social status, our careers, or our own perceived moral goodness to shield us from consequence.
We are negotiating with the truth, hearing the clear warnings of reality, but delaying repentance, assuming tomorrow will just be exactly like today.
Or we have recognized our own spiritual poverty, and we are sheltered entirely under the unmerited, distinguishing grace of the Lamb.
The text makes it terrifyingly clear. There is no third option.
If we are trusting in earthly security, this passage warns us that it can all vanish at midnight. The systems of the world, no matter how powerful they seem, are ultimately fragile before their creator.
And as we close out this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final lingering thought to mull over on your own as you go about your day. We spent time earlier discussing the profound supernatural silence in Goshen. The detail that not even a feral dog sharpened its tongue or growled.
Yeah.
Think about those silent dogs one more time. What if their silence wasn't just a hyperbolic metaphor for peace?
That's a haunting question.
What if in that terrifying, unprecedented midnight hour, the animals were utterly silent because the physical earth itself recognized the heavy footsteps of its creator walking through the streets?
Wow.
And what if the great agonizing cry of Egypt was simply the sound of humanity finally realizing a moment too late that their independence from him was always an illusion?